Hello, everyone. This is the 26th episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England. For this episode, we start a new interview series with Mr. Esteban Bekerman, Argentinian journalist, football history researcher, and professor of football history as we discuss the history of Argentina football. Mr. Esteban Bekerman is an Argentinian football historian and journalist professor at the Circulo, the Periodistas, Deportivas, y en Taller de Investigacion, Historia, sobre Futbol, Circle of sports journalists and historical research workshop on football. He is the founder of entretiempos.com.ar, which is a center of football culture that includes production of magazines, books, workshops, and consulting events. We aim to have a series of interviews with Mr. Bekerman where we will examine the history of Argentina football from its origins in the late 19th century and then into different decades and eras of Argentina football for subsequent podcasts. There are many themes that might be similar to our recent Uruguay podcast with Professor Aldo Mazzucchelli. We will look at the similarities as well as major differences, whether sporting or cultural, that impacted the game.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. Could you just say a little bit about your football background, some of your early memories and your football journey to this point?
Okay, I started watching football back in 1976 or 77. My first memories are from that year, and I was just a little kid, as a lot of others here in Argentina, who was taken to the fields by his parents. And at that time, you in Argentina could go to a football match as you could go to see a movie or anything like that, because it was more than a pastime or a way to enjoy your free time than any other thing. I started my relation with football by watching games without being really a supporter of any team, and I liked the show, the spectacle, or the color in it, without knowing really well what I was seeing. Back in that time, I was really too young to understand the game itself. But I really got chased or enchanted with the game, because I liked so much to see what was happening there in the fields and also with the public. So I started drawing about football matches back there when I was 6 or 7. And, well, it led to having the appetite to know so much or to know much about the sport and about the players. But then when I was 8 years or maybe 9, I came into a latency or a period of not really giving so much care to the sport. But in 1986, Argentina, as you know, won the World Championship. And then all my passion, all the things I have really a little buried, came again with so much strength and power to me again. And well, from that time to the present, I couldn't stop, and I won't stop to collect and to find and to research and to look for about the football history and the club's history here in Argentina. So since I'm 14 years old, I'm mad about this sport, and I'm really a football fan, but also a fan of researching and collecting things about this passion I have.
You sound just like us.
Okay.
So let's get started. Much like neighboring Uruguay, the roots of Argentina football appear to be linked with the expatriate British community in Argentina in this late 19th century. Can you explain how the influence of the game grew as a result?
Yes, it's really similar than in Uruguay, what happened here in Argentina, but it has some differences between one country and another. Because here, I think it was more important the role that played some educators in some colleges, not only from the British community, but also in the national or state institutions. And they were really the first and the principal pioneers of the sport here in Argentina. In Uruguay, the football came more than consequence of the railways development and the masters of the football that came with the railways. But here in Argentina, the railways were important mostly in the interior, like in Cordoba or Santa Fe or Rosario. But in Buenos Aires, I think it was more important that role played by some educators like Alexander Watson Houghton, who is really well known as Argentinian football's father, and a lot of others too, because even before Alexander Watson Houghton, there was another educator who has a really interesting story, who was Reverend George Gibbons Pillsbury, and he was really the first one to teach football here in a college in Argentina back in the 70s.
Does the history of football in Argentina, does it predate Uruguay's, or are they contemporary?
Well, it predates Uruguay because it starts in 1867 or 68, but there is some latency also here in Argentinian football development from that first match, which was played at the Park 3 of February here in Argentina, 3 de Febrero Parque. But again, it was not the start of the football competitions. Nothing was really developed or started with that matches. It was only beginning of the practice of football and of the practice that could be researched, because we have some journalistic registries of that in the local paper, The Standard, which was for the British community, which was from the British community also. And well, it really is something we can say started the practice of football here, or could be documented as the beginnings of the football here, that matches at the planetary zone here in Argentina. But I don't like very much to say that the football started really there, because it was not really football. And I'm not the only one to tell this kind of things. The best investigator of Argentinian football's origins was a journalist named Agustín Celsa Lozano, or Salustiano González. He was called Salustiano González, but signed his articles as Agustín Celsa Lozano. And he says that was not really football, because there was only 8 players by side, and all the players belonged to the same club, and the rules were not really like the ones football are known to have. So it was really something like football, what we had first here in Argentina back in 66 or 67. Sorry.
You mentioned the Scottish Alexander Watson Houghton. Can you discuss his influence on the game in Argentina?
Yeah, I think he was really the most important teacher who brought football to Argentina and started to have some influence in the developing of the sport here. But he was not the only one. And, Watson Houghton is really well known to have founded a school because of his intention of teaching football here, because he was hired to work in another institute who was from the Scottish community or St. Andrew's Scotch School, but then he refused to teach there because they didn't allow him to teach football as he wanted. So he founded the English high school, the Buenos Aires English High School, in February 1884, and there he started to really raise some generation of players who were really good at that time and really important here because they formed the first really great team here in Argentina that was the alumni, first called Buenos Aires English High School Athletic Club.
Can you name some of the other pioneers of the game in Argentina and tell us about their contribution?
Yeah, George Gibbons Pillsbury was the first educator who taught football here in a Flores Collegiate School here in Buenos Aires. And that was a school for the British community, sure. But some locals also attended there, locals from the high class, obviously, because it was a paid institution, a private institution. But the interesting thing is that Gibbons Pillsbury brought with him the practice of the sport here to the local environment or the college environment. So he is, I think, unfairly forgotten in most of the relates or the stories about Argentinian football origins, because he was really important and his history is really interesting. He was ordained there in England, and then he came to teach here in South America, and first he was in the littoral here, where he has some contact with the local Indians, and he started there to teach some sport and to try to people could play some sports like football. But that was only a beginning, as I said, and Watson Houghton did it most regularly and most formally, and Watson Houghton is really the one who really tried to teach football most strongly, we can say. But there was also Thomas Hogg, who organized the first football match back in 66 or 67. Sorry again. But then it was an Irish pioneer who was Santiago Fitzsimon, who brought football here first to the Corrientes province and then to Buenos Aires because he was teaching there. And his son, who was Juan Fitzsimons, was the founder of one of the first really Creoles club or Argentinian clubs, who was the Club Atlético Estudiantes here, which was formed by students of some colleges, not from the British community, but from the locals. They were all Creoles or people with Spanish and Latin origins. And that was really a great step to the development of football here, because when they started to play in those colleges, the football practice here really advanced a lot, and the locals could have some contact with the sport, mainly thankful to the actions of that professors. And there was another Irish also, who was Patrick McCarthy, who was hired by Santiago Fitzsimon as an English professor, even when he was not really a teacher and had never done some teaching there in Ireland before coming to Argentina. He just came here as a person who tries to do an adventure and to see what happens by coming here to South America. And well, he was an enthusiastic fan of sports in general, because he was not only a footballer but also a boxer. He played box, and he was a box referee here in Argentina, a well-known referee of boxing. But also he played football, and he taught football in a state institution, who was the National Commerce School, like was called back then the Carlos Pellegrini School. Right now it is called Carlos Pellegrini. And well, there he started to teach football at request of Santiago Fitzsimon, who knew him because he was playing with his son in Estudiantes de Buenos Aires. So he brought him to teach football in that college he was ruling, by designing or by naming him English professor, even when he was not really a teacher or a professor, but only an Irish who could really get well with the Fitzsimons, and to teach football also, because he was really a great footballer. And that is really important, because if you see how was Boca Juniors founded, you can see that 3 of the 5 founders of the club were going to that school where Santiago Fitzsimon and Patrick McCarthy were working as a ruler and a professor, respectively. So Patrick McCarthy was the teacher of 3 of the 5 founders of Boca Juniors.
How was the first league established, and was it still under British influence? Yeah,
in 1891 we have a first essay of a federation here of football, and a league played by clubs which were really educational institutions or teams formed by players that were attending some British schools. So that's another good reason to say that the schools were really most important here than the railways. No, but that first league only lasted for an year in 1891. In 1892, it was dissolved because of the lack of funds and support. And in 1893 was founded another league. It was called just like the first one, Argentine Association Futbol League. But this league could have already Alexander Watson Houghton as one of its founders. So it really had the strength to keep on or move on with some more power and regularity in its competence. So that was really the beginning of the practice of football here in an official way. Now, AFA is founded, like the same AFA says, in 1893, because it recognizes only that second version of the Argentine Association Futbol League. So that first one, it was really a good try, but no more than that. The really first one for AFA, at least, is the second Argentine Association Football League, which was founded in 1893. And there was the Buenos Aires English High School Athletic Club and some others like Lomas Athletic, which was the first team to attain the title. But it really didn't care so much what this league could develop until 1899 or the first years of the 20th century, because the really first great team or first great champion here in Argentina was the Buenos Aires English High School in 90. So before that, nothing is really well known or recorded or registered here. In the first years of the 20th century, now we can have a lot of information about what happened and really some good records of any match played since then. And also we have some really good records of the matches that played the British teams, which came to Argentina to teach the sport and to play here, and that were really, really important to develop the sport and to let people here know how the sport was practiced there in England, like Southampton in 1904 and some others back in that time.
Just to follow up, the group that established the league in 1891 and the one that established a year later, was there any overlap or were they completely different people involved?
No, there was some contact points or points in common between one another. We can say that they were hanging out together with the people of the alumni or the Buenos Aires English High School, even when the Buenos Aires English High School was not into that first league founded in 1891. So it was only a matter of time to them to organize better, to start with the second version of the league. And really, that first version was really the first step for organized football here in Argentina in a good fashion, or in a fashion that could be useful to form 2 years later the definitive league, which is regularly played till now, a case which is unique in the world, because the only country with regularly played championships and no interrupted by any war or something since 1893 is Argentina.
Thank you. And you also touched on the English teams that visited, and we discussed this in our Uruguay podcast, that obviously many English teams toured South America in the early 20th century. How did the public respond to that in Argentina, and how did that help to develop the game?
Well, it's really interesting because the public was really so much for that time. The first match was played in June 26 of 1904, were attended by 80,000 people. It was played by the alumni against Southampton, which won 3-0. And then there was some other matches played by Southampton. The people never came down to less from 5,000 people. So really, it moved a lot of people, and especially from the higher class. The higher class was really interested in this kind of spectacle that was football at the time. And well, it's really interesting because the second match against Southampton was played by a team of British players which were playing here in Argentina, like Percy Hutton, John Diggs, and others who were born in England or in the United Kingdom. So it's really interesting. They lose, by the way, 10-0. And it's really interesting because they were seen as British even when they were playing here in Argentina. But they were not really aware of the ways of playing this sport like it was played in the island, no? In England especially. So the influence of that visitors was really, really important because they showed how to play really in a professional way, because they were professionals and they were really serious playing, and they were not like taking really good time or much time in passing the ball. They really liked to play or played in a direct way, like most of the English teams did, mainly in the past and maybe nowadays too. So they really were important in the development of that style of football here in Argentina, because the alumni and the other clubs started to play or want to play like them, really directly and with not really a great passing game or much passing, but only shooting and trying to score, trying to score the most goals they could have. So they were really, really important. And in that way, they were the founders of the styles of that time here in Argentina, because the fact that there were Scottish teachers here or Irish also in the schools like that, Buenos Aires English High School and others, was not really as important as the matches that these British teams played here. That was really the model that followed the players of that time to play. That was a difference also with Uruguay, that could develop earlier than Argentina a local style with some more passing and with some more respect for the ball, if you want to call it that way. And that's because in Uruguay it was really important the role played by a Scottish player who was Sean Harley. Sean Harley was really the master of the Uruguayan football. And also José Piendibene, who was called El Maestro, or the master there in Uruguay, recognized him as his teacher, as his master, and the one who teached how to play in a more artistic way, in a more slow way, with more passing and more respect for the ball, like in Scotland, which always had a style more based in passing or touches with the ball before to shoot than in England. No?
At what point do the locals blend in with the British in adopting the game?
Well, we can say that started to happen in the potreros or the fields here in the last years of the 19th century. So that took time to be shown or to appear in the official competencies, because there only were British players or players with British origins and some other with some Latin surname, but because he was attending to a British school. Really, the first teams not formed by ex-students of the British schools, and the first teams not formed by a majority of British came down here at the beginnings of the 20th century, like Estudiantes de Buenos Aires, which was the first team formed by locals who were playing this sport since some years before, but not in a British school, not in a school ruled by British, or maybe, yes, ruled by British, but not for British people only, and not for the higher class only, because they were from the middle class also. And well, they have some economical power to go there, because at that time a family of workers could not send a boy to study in the secondary school here because of the lack of money. But even so, the first teams of locals could start to play also officially, and not only in the fields or in the potreros here back in the first years of the 20th century, like Estudiantes de Buenos Aires and Argentino de Quilmes also, who was also, again, founded by locals, but with a component of with an important component of British in its formation, because the British influence, I think, lasted for or until the finals of that first decade of the 20th century. That was the last decade of British influence really here in Argentinian football.
Argentina is also known for a large Italian expatriate community. How did they take to the game, and what was their involvement in the early years?
Well, it's interesting, because some people think that we are really Italians disguised as Argentinians in some many ways. But really, in what football matters, it was not really like that. The influence of the Italian community in football is really insignificant back there in the first decade of the 20th century. I think for that time, or by that time, they were really blending in the local community and forming like a new kind of player and a new kind of citizen here in Argentina, because they were not really Italians. The sons of the Italians came to this country in the late 19th century were not really Italians, but they were really like another kind of people who blended and who start to have some new characteristics here. And it's really interesting that Boca, by example, who was founded really by some locals from the Italian community mostly, really it had a good support from the Italian community there in its neighborhood, which was La Boca, obviously. But there was not another reason to say that Italians really can be or could be influencing the sport here. Boca and River and other teams were formed mostly by people who was part of the Italian community, but not really Italians, but sons of them. And they, as sons of Italians here, started to have some really new characteristics or style in living a lot different from his fathers, because they blended so much here and really fast. So I think there was not really an important influence, or you can't speak about a style who has really something in common with the Italian fashion of playing football, because here the football developed because another reasons, not because that kind of influence of the Italians. Even the first local idol or the first real idol in Boca was a player with some Italian surname who was Pedro Calomino, but he was not really Italian. He was a son of a French marriage who gave him in adoption to an Italian family. His real name was Pedro Bleo Fougnol. He was really French in his origins. So the DNA can't really be blamed for him to have played in some way. He really was Argentinian, more than Italian or French or anything else. The Argentinian style was really an Argentinian invention and not a style which can be assimilated or compared or maybe entitled to our Italian or Spanish or even French genes.
Well, that's a topic for a future podcast, because a lot of these Italian players, they would become oriundis in Europe and play a significant part in the national teams of Italy or Spain even later on. But that's for a different day. Getting back to this era, the first outstanding team of this early era that you mentioned is Alumni. Can you describe its institution and its importance to Argentina history in a more detailed way?
Yeah, well, Alumni is not only the result of Alexander Watson Houghton's work, but also he had some really important collaborators here. One was a collaborator or a teacher he brought specifically to train the players or train the students and to let them know about football rules. And that was the same that other colleges were doing by that time, like even the St. Andrews Scotch School, where Alexander Watson Houghton started to work here in Argentina and then refused to keep working because he could not teach football as he wanted. But Alexander Watson Houghton and the Buenos Aires English High School and the collaborators he had there were really important. And there is some registry of William Waters, collaborator of Alexander Watson Houghton, that collaborator who was hired to teach football here in the Buenos Aires English High School, coming from England with the first balls or the first football balls made in England that came here to Argentina. That happened in 86. So it's really an indicator of the influence and the passion Watson Houghton had for this sport. The local newspaper La Nación announced the coming of Mr. Waters from Liverpool here, taking with him these football balls made in England. So it was really, really an important fact to the development of football here. And he had also another collaborator, which was really important, who was Andrew Mack. Andrew Mack was really born in England, not like Watson Houghton or Waters, who were Scottish or Scots. Andrew Mack also helped a lot to develop the football here, and he has also a very interesting story. We could track that story because there are some interesting registries which we can now have thanks to the technology and the digitalization of some files. And we can see him studying in Sussex, in Worth, Sussex School, and being matriculated there and to coming here as an assistant master at the English High School since 97 to 1912. Then he was going to England again to serve in the Great War, the First War, and well, he then stayed there for a while and he came back to Argentina after that war. So Andrew Mack is another important character here in that alumni's first time, and he played a lot for alumni. He played from 1901, or maybe he also played for the English high school first, where the alumni was called like that, in 1899 and 1900. But in 1901, the alumni started to play as alumni, and since then he was still playing for the alumni till 1911. He played almost 100 matches for the alumni, and he finally died here in Buenos Aires in 1936. So he was really also an important teacher of the alumni players, and a good fellowship, good fellow for him, because he had him as a player also.
Esteban, there's a story about those first footballs that were being imported from the United Kingdom to Argentina that I've heard, that they arrived deflated, so they couldn't be recognised as footballs. Yeah. And when they came through customs, the customs officers didn't really know what they were, and they registered them as things for the crazy English. Have you heard that story?
Yeah,
do you think it could be true?
I heard it, and it's true. It's all documented. You can say that that's the most logical thing that could happen at that time, because here no one, or really the locals, didn't know about football days, or like a little years later. So it could happen perfectly, that in the customs.
Yeah, it's nice to think it's a true story.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. In many countries, virtually everywhere where football developed, there was this debate between amateur football and professionalism. And how was that handled in Argentina?
Yeah, we have a really strong debate about the difference between amateurism and professionalism. And I can say that mostly ignorant people is the one who doesn't bring attention or doesn't consider it important what happens in the amateur era, because really without what happens in the amateur era, we can't really understand almost anything of what happened in the professional times. So a lot of things happened in the amateur era, and we cannot say there was only one period in that time. Argentine football is worth to be divided not only between amateurism and professionalism, but in different stages of evolution or periods of times, regarding not only the fact of the players being paid or having some retribution for their skills or the practice of the sport. And we can say there was a first stage that was that one we talked about in the first or the last years of the 19th century, and there is also another stage which was the first decade of the 20th century, there with the alumni as a really important team and a way of passing the football passion to the locals. And in the second decade of the 20th century is when we can see really how football is expanded among the local population, and the local clubs appear in the first division and in official football in general as really important sides, because before that era we couldn't see really much teams formed by locals, with the exceptions of Estudiantes de Buenos Aires and Argentino de Quilmes, and maybe one another like Porteño maybe. But the very first moment, or the true moment, where the Argentinian football history is split into new way of playing football and the first way, which was the English way, is in the first years of the second decade of the 20th century. That is the really key moment to understand how the locals were starting to play in a new way, and how the Argentinian football came to life really with some new characteristics or ways to be played. And it took some years also to see really local players or players who learned to play in the neighborhoods and not with an English teacher teaching him in the national team also. The national team was for many years, even in that second decade of the 20th century, formed by the people of the higher class, who was not really at that time maybe too willing to share their condition of members of the national team with some other players from the lower classes. No, the first one, and this is really an important discovery I could do in my workshop, the first really important player who could have some consideration of the local authorities of football to play in the national team back in that time was Calomino. Calomino was really the founder of the new style here in Argentina, because he could show that style in the national team before any other player.
Wasn't there a dissident federation because of this professionalism issue at some point?
Yeah, not because the professionalism, and not because maybe the appearing of money really, but yes, because of the appearing of players and teams like Calomino and like Argentino de Quilmes and like others, like Racing, by example, which started to dominate Argentinian football then in that second decade, in the first years of that second decade of the 20th century. And because a lot of teams wanted to play in the official competencies, and they couldn't do it as they want, or they wanted also to manage football and not only to play football. They wanted to rule the association. And well, it was just in 1912 when the association became or moved his name to Asociación Argentina de Futbol. Before then, it was named Argentine Football Association. And just in 1912, it was accepted the Spanish translation or the Spanish denomination. And in that same year happened the first division, or the first separation between two federations, because Gimnasia y Esgrima of Buenos Aires, which was a club of the higher class, tried to demonstrate that they could keep football direction for them, as it was happening in the country, that the higher class was ruling the country without any other kind of people really getting to the management roles or the political roles that were really important. And Gimnasia y Esgrima of Buenos Aires really had the greatest pitch, the greatest stadium for that time. And its board could just said that, well, we are the most rich and the most powerful club here in Argentina, so we deserve to rule football as we want. And well, it was because of the visit of an English team, Swindon Town, in 1912, that Gimnasia y Esgrima decided to break relations with the association, because it was forced to charge, to make its associated people to pay for attending that match against the Swindon Town. And that match took place in the Gimnasia y Esgrima of Buenos Aires field, but Gimnasia y Esgrima couldn't make any objections, or did some objections, but it was not allowed its claims for its associated to could assist that much without paying. So for that reason, Gimnasia y Esgrima decided to found another federation along with Porteño and other clubs. And for that, Gimnasia y Esgrima and Porteño, which were both teams of the higher class, offered a lot of teams of the second division the chance to play in the first division, to have some number of participants in their league. So they did it well, and they started to organize a parallel championship done or along with the Association One, and between 1912 till 1914 we had two first division championships being played parallelously here, and they're both official according to AFA.
Boca Juniors and River Plate are one of the greatest football rivalries in the history of the game. What triggered this rivalry? What was the earliest memory of this rivalry? As well as, is the myth about the Swedish flag true about Boca Juniors?
Well, some said it's not really accurate, that version. But I really don't know what was or what could be some other version. I don't really know what could be the real origin of the colors of Boca, if it's not that one which is really the most known version. But the rivalry between Boca and River started with its very foundation, because they are both from La Boca. They're neighborhoods, they're neighbors in its origins. So they just have a neighborhood rivalry in that years of their beginnings. And maybe also it happened something that is not really well known here. That is that Boca was really the club of the Boca Juniors. No, it is named after that because it was really the club of the children of La Boca, of the La Boca people, and its sons could see Boca as a team of their own. And River was, from its very beginning, more a team opened to other players and other people than the ones of La Boca. I said always, River is more a club for the nation and not for a neighborhood only, since its very beginnings. And Boca, for many, many years, was considered by its own members as a club for La Boca. Just in the 20s or the late years of the second decade of the 20th century, Boca appears as a club of the of more than a neighborhood, of more than a local and a really closed community. River is really more open and cosmopolitan from that very beginnings and from that first years of the 20th century.
And just on the national team, could you explain the origins of the national team? And was there still a British influence in the early years of the national team?
Yeah, also it was really another expression of that ways the football was taught and was spread about the local British community, you know? Because it was formed by British players or players with British origins, and it took a long time to be really a national team. But from that very beginnings of the national teams there in the first years of the 20th century, you can see how the alumni players are really important and are the base of the team, and they were feeling like really some different thing than the British players born in Britain, because forming the national team, you had to be Argentinian, you had to be really born here, and many of that players who are considered British are really locals, are really players born in Argentina with or from British families, like the Browns, the Browns, the Brown brothers, who are really known here as the first family of players that could have some really important influence in the national team. And well, there was another players, but the British players were frequently used as a sparring for that national team in that time. They were used to test the national team by forming a side with the best British players born in England and Scotland and Ireland that were playing here in Argentina. And that's really interesting also, because if we could have at that time some of that players born in the United Kingdom playing for the national side, maybe the story would be different or would have been different. But the alumni and the people of the British community that were born here in Argentina didn't allow that. They wanted to share their passion for the country and not only the football by being only with another members or another players raised and born here in Argentina. That's really an interesting field to research and to get some new discoveries and info and stories that could be told, because it can serve as a way of knowing how the Argentinian identity was really raised or formed or born. And not only in football, obviously.
The main historical international rivalry in South American football, especially in these early years, was between Argentina and Uruguay. Was this rivalry mainly due to geographical reasons, sporting, or perhaps cultural reasons?
Yeah, I think the rivalry was pushed mainly because of some reasons regarding the good level of the practice of football here and in Uruguay. These are the two countries where football was first developed here in South America, and where football had the earliest good level between South American countries, or in South America. Brazil came as an important country in football some years later. Well, that, and obviously for geographical reasons also, was the fact that pushed the rivalry, but was also maybe another reason that was that Uruguay had some teams formed not only by members of the higher class, but also from workers of the railways. And the railway was really more important in Uruguay than in Buenos Aires to spread football. So that's another reason to explain the differences and the fact in Uruguay, the locals and even the black people was accepted before than in Argentina into the national team. That is also an interesting field to research because there are some really important differences between one country and another. We can see really clearly how in Uruguay the national team changes in its formation on in what matters to the origins of its members much before than in Argentina. You can see in 1910 or 1911 in the national team of Uruguay, players like, maybe a little later, players like Ángel Romano or some others that were born or raised from the poorest level of the Uruguayan society. They were really members of the lower class. And here in Argentina, the national team hadn't that kind of integration between the higher class and the lower class, mainly, I think, till 1918 or 1917. In Uruguay, you could see that perfectly clear much years before. Here, the exception was Calomino, really. Calomino was an exception in that first years of the second decade of the 20th century.
And why do you think it was that these two nations had a head start over the rest of the countries in South America in football terms?
Well, they just had some people bringing football here before, I think. In Brazil, it was a little later, but that happened. But also the reasons on the integrations between classes are important, I think, because in Brazil, football was really, really more restricted to the higher class, and not only forming the national team, but also to be played, to be taught, and to be spread between the locals. So maybe that was another reason that could help football to develop first here in Argentina and in Uruguay than in Brazil.
Internationally, in the early years of Copa America, Uruguay appeared to have the upper hand. However, Argentina bounced back most notably in the latter half of the 1920s. This set up their rivalry on the global stage with the Olympics of 1928 and ultimately the 1930 World Cup. And we will examine this era in our next podcast with Mr. Bekerman. So once again, I would like to thank you, Esteban, for your participation in this series. And as always, everyone feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog, Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. And on Facebook, I'm under Soccer Nostalgia. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888letter. And you may also follow the podcast on Spotify under Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. Mr. Bekerman can be contacted on Twitter at EGERDEK, as well as at Entretiempos R. And his website is entretiempos.com.r, and his blog is estebanbekerman.blogspot.com. Again, all this information is listed on the podcast and blog posting. So Esteban, thank you very much. Looking forward to
Thank you, Shahan and Paul. Really great to discuss or talk about this passion I have with you. And I'm sorry for my inconvenience or my language problems, but
no, not at all. Not at all.
I think you could understand what I said.
Of course, perfectly.
And that's the main goal. So, well, thanks again, and let's keep in touch and keep doing this, which is really great.
Definitely.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's great. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you, Esteban.